We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to say good morning and welcome to SEAC 2020, the virtual version. I see a couple of you who were with us already this morning, so thank you for continuing to ride along with us today. Just want to go over a couple of technical issues in terms of how we're going to manage questions. So you should all notice, if you go to the bottom, that you have chat and Q&A in this webinar. The way that we would like for you to engage is chat is being used exactly right for saying hello, greeting folks if you'd like to. Obviously, you can send us any private messages, those of us who, the three of us who were designated as panelists. But our intention is that if there are questions along the way where Ryan and Susan would like feedback, that you will engage in the chat responding to those. However, for questions along the way, we're going to ask that you try to intentionally ask those in the Q&A box. That way we'll be able to, because you know sometimes the chat can get filled up pretty quickly, and we'll be able to really distinguish questions. Obviously, there'll be time at the end for Q&A. However, if there's something that's really relevant to a particular slide, if you really want something answered before they move on, I'll be monitoring that on their behalf. And so, as we did earlier today, I will stop them and share that question with them. So again, chat is for interacting with any questions they ask or with each other, but Q&A is for responding or asking questions about the actual presentation. I am actually also going to be recording, and this is for a couple of folks who shared that something came up and they can't be with us today, so that will be happening as well. Also want to be sure that you were in the right section, session. So this is learning from community partner experiences with students, and there is a simultaneous session happening. So if you are in fact in the wrong session or went to the wrong link, you can certainly send an email to all panelists, and I will respond and give you the correct link. Otherwise, I think we are ready to get started, and so I want to introduce Ryan Nilson, who is the Senior Program Officer for Community Engagement in the Carolina Center for Public Service at UNC Chapel Hill. And we also have Susan Worley, who is the Director of Volunteers for Youth Incorporated. And so I will turn it over to them.
Thanks, Leslie. And thank you all for being with us today for what I believe is Susan and my both first webinar and our first virtual SEAC. So this is an exciting event. And I would much rather see all of your faces. So we're going to try to make this as interactive as possible given our format. So we'll be talking today about learning from community partner experiences working with students with a little bit of a focus on a project we've been working on over the past year at UNC Chapel Hill. Susan introduced us briefly, but I'll just say the Carolina Center for Public Service is a pan-university public service center at UNC, and which basically just means our charge is to serve the whole university, and we work with students, faculty, staff, and community partners in supporting public service and community engagement.
And I'm the Director of Volunteers for Youth, as Leslie mentioned earlier, and also have served as the chair of the Center for Public Service Advisory Board. And I've been connected with the center for a number of years through various programs working with students. And I can't help but note that coronavirus pandemic has really aged me from that picture, which was really not that long ago. But hopefully we'll all go back to looking like our best selves soon. So we're hoping to get started by having you all answer a question that we have for you, and that is the most basic question of all. What is it that you're hoping to get out of this session today?
And we invite you in the chat to respond not only to the panelists, but to all attendees so that you can see what other people are responding as well. We'll reflect back some of what we see, but we probably will not be able to get to everyone. Mary Morrison is interested in how we gather partner feedback. Katie is interested in ideas for what more we should, how we should train our students ahead of time when they enter a volunteer community space. Lindsay Miller-Furinas is interested in finding the balance of getting partner input without burdening them with excessive data collection. Patty Clayton is interested in co-created relationships, partnerships among student, staff, community members, faculty. Hope to hear some ideas related to that today. That's a good, like it's a little bit of a sense of where you all are coming from. So continue to see other people's responses. I invite you to. And we have one poll question. Have you ever done a survey to gather input from community partners across your program? So not individual program evaluations, but please go ahead and respond to that so we get a sense of what people are coming to this conversation with. So there should be a poll up in your screen. You can answer in the next 5 seconds. That would be great.
Looks like we're waiting for about 7 more people to respond if you want to in the next 2 seconds.
Thanks, Leslie.
All right, I'm going to end the poll and show the results.
Great, so we're fairly evenly split. It looks like a little bit more than half of us have done something like this before, like the project we're going to be talking about today. A little bit less than half of you haven't. So that's some important context. And we'd love to, learn from your insight along the way as much as that's possible. So what we're hoping to do today is what we're doing now, a little welcome introduction, have some conversation before we really jump into our project about why we even care about community partner experiences. A little bit, we'll give you an overview of our project, the scope and goals, what we actually have been doing, share some of the results, and then end in a, insights, sharing a little bit of our insights and the use of data that we have done and that we plan to do. And we will be continuing to try to ask questions like this throughout. So please be ready to respond to keep it moving. And we do invite questions throughout from you as well. So again, thanks for being here.
And we're going to start out with a question for you that Ryan just mentioned. Why do you think we ask the community about their experiences? What's the point of it?
This is one of those questions to me that hopefully feels very obvious, but might be under asked in our field. So we'll look for some of what you all are saying. Mutual benefit. Ruby Messick says to better serve both the student and the partners. We want to make sure our students are gaining what is needed and that the partner sees a benefit as well to ensure the community needs are understood. Address challenges or gaps in student preparation. Great. We'll keep moving, but please keep responding, and hopefully other folks will be paying attention as well. So one point of reference for us, we go to this publication, Unheard Voices, Randy Stoker and colleagues in 2009, that basically the suggestion in this quote here is that we in the university, we know how to study things. We evaluate and research the heck out of everybody. But we find nonetheless in our field that we know a lot about what students experience. We know a fair amount about what faculty experience, and increasingly about what civic community engagement administrators are experiencing. And we really know significantly less about community organizations and partners. And so we're asking this question because it's sort of under-asked in our field, and it's pivotal, vital for us to understand whether we're doing what we're setting out to do effectively, particularly in our COVID context. I think that we see a significant focus right now, appropriately, on student needs and university needs. We're really focused on what will it take for students to go back to campus even in the fall. You know, what are all the changes that are needing to happen in order for us to do anything that looks anything like normal. And we're really focused on our own selves within the university right now. And that's happening at the same time that there's some radical changes happening in our communities as well. So hunger, financial insecurity, the non-existence in some communities of youth programs due to fear about spread of the virus. And hopefully we're all taking this as sort of a moment of deep reflection. You know, this data that we've gathered is primarily from pre-COVID, but we're taking this opportunity to really look at what partners have said about what things were under normal times. And this is an opportunity for us to reflect on that and see it more clearly, maybe because we're not clearly in normal times. So this is an undercurrent, but not really a primary focus of this session, I'll say. That said, we did have our focus groups in the first week of remote work, and wanted to share a few quick snippets from that.
And some of the things that we heard during those early days was all of our stuff is either in person or not at all. We also heard we have been able to, since we have a communications intern, do a lot of work remotely or online. I would think just really good constant communication between the organizations and UNC would be really helpful for us.
Which is just to suggest that even with a small group of partners we were talking to, they're pretty dramatically different experiences, and what partnership will continue to look like in this context. Also need to say something about the significant, another significant element of our moment right now is Black Lives Matter protest movement that's happening, and particularly inspired by George Floyd's murder. And this is really a moment where we're mandated to look at how white supremacy culture and racism shows up in all of our institutions. And I think a lot of people are doing that. And particularly, I'm, you know, a white community engagement administrator speaking from a perspective of a PWI like UNC Chapel Hill. And this is something we really need to be looking at, that this moment is demanding of us. This is a quote from Tania Mitchell's Service Learning as a Pedagogy of Whiteness, and her colleagues referencing a study that that found that service learning is being implemented mostly by white faculty with mostly white students at predominantly white institutions to serve mostly poor individuals and mostly people of color. So that's something that we need to interrogate pretty deeply, and centering community voices is a big part of what that looks like, in my understanding, acknowledging that it's not all white faculty and white students, primarily white institutions. This conversation looks very different in different contexts, but it seems important to acknowledge as well. Again, that's not a significant primary focus of our project, of our study, but it is an undercurrent to our moment, and hopefully the conversation we're having today as well. And the goals of our project explicitly come almost word for word from our Center for Public Service strategic plan that we developed primarily last spring, 2019. And our goals are to increase the centers and the university's understanding of community partner collaboration and connection needs and assets, to develop and maintain a list of community organizations that work with CCPS programs, which is something we didn't have, to assess the benefits and challenges of working with us at the center and within the university, and to have a really applied vision in which we are trying to use this information to improve what we're doing, to improve our programs. So our study team, in order to undertake a project like this, we pulled together a great team, a large team, 3 community partner representatives from our CCPS advisory board. Thank you, Susan, for being a part of this and here today. Also, April Warren from Student U, Melvin Jackson from the Prime Collective. We have 5 center staff working on this. Basically what we consider our program team, and our director and associate director, Kate Palmer, Becca Bender, Margaret Barrett, and Lynn Blanchard and I. And we did have some student leader input throughout, although we intentionally didn't have students on the team that was designing and sort of asking these questions. So it's a little bit about where we were coming from, our scope and methods. We decided basically to focus more on what the experience is like working with students rather than the impact that they're making and that our programs are making, largely because we see that as an aspect of this work that we are likely better able to influence and change, as sort of what it's like to work with the people that we're sending out into the field rather than the impact of the work itself, where it's a lot harder to understand what that impact is and to have much influence on it, strictly from the university side. We also decided to focus on students, even though a lot of partnerships happen with faculty and staff, and we want to look at all students. There might be significant differences between paid and unpaid work, service learning courses, and volunteers who just show up, and that's part of what we're interested in. So we tried to cast a wide net and again really focus on an applied vision of what this will look like. So we had 2 main methods of gathering data. We sent out a survey in October of 2019 to well over 1,000 community partner representatives that we had, either direct program partners or that students had self-reported that they had worked with, that they were their volunteer supervisor. And that's a pretty large group of who we were sending this out to. We have a program called the Buckley Public Service Scholars Program with about 1,700 students who are reporting what they're doing. So some of these partners we have no direct contact with, and we had a pretty significant response rate, over 22%. There were a fair amount of bounce backs in there. So if we looked really closely, we might have a higher percent of people who actually received the survey. And then we had 2 focus groups. We allowed people to opt in to self-identify as interested in talking more. And those 2 focus groups ended up being March 2020, the first week of remote work, as mentioned earlier. And they basically volunteered to do that. We had 7 signed up for each. They're facilitated by our community partner representatives on this project, and only participants in each. And Susan, did you want to say anything about what that experience was like?
Yep, it was my first Zoom experience, and there I was trying to facilitate a meeting, and somehow found myself sitting on the floor of my office amongst a bunch of boxes with my telephone, so you can imagine. But I really appreciated the investment of the people who participated, because we all remember what that week was like and just how crazy everything was. And I thought it said a lot that basically about half the people who had signed up to come to a meeting actually participated via Zoom and had a lot of worthwhile things to say. So I thought it was a really good experience all in all.
Thanks. So jumping to our results a little bit and what we actually learned. This first question, who are our students working with? So some of our first questions, we found that they're mostly very small or very large organizations. There was a lot less in the middle, and by very small, we mean less than 5 full-time equivalents, or very large, more than 50. Not surprising in that some of our most consistent partners are school systems and healthcare systems, and where we know our students are going, and that a significant majority have more than 25 volunteers that work with the organization, but less than 10% are UNC students, which was an important point of reference. Sometimes I think we may overstate our our influence of the role of UNC students in these organizations. So it's actually for most a relatively small part of the portion of the volunteers who show up. A lot of the organizations, at least that were responding, are focused on children and youth education, health and wellness, and a little over a third we limited to North Carolina organizations, or what appeared to be, and a little over a third were right there in Chapel Hill, Carborough, and then they were pretty evenly distributed. Another third almost were in the Triangle, Raleigh, Durham, and then some significant representation from other parts of the state. And we found it pretty interesting that there were significant other UNC connections that the respondents were telling us about. The top ways that they said they were most connected to UNC were staff and faculty volunteers, as well as student volunteers, or that faculty and staff were offering technical assistance, and that could be contract, paid, or not, or on a voluntary basis. A third of our survey respondents were UNC alum. And Susan, did you want to comment on how this kind of reflects or doesn't your own experience?
Sure. So I have many UNC connections, including I am an alum, and we have a number of faculty and staff who volunteer with our organization. I think you really can't overstate how many connections there are between the organizations in Chapel Hill and Carborough and the university.
Ryan?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we have a question. Mary at Elon says they've had some challenges with finding health-focused partners because of privacy issues. And so you mentioned, of course, that a significant number of the folks you work with are health-focused partners. So how do you identify them, and can you give us some examples?
Yeah, I think that the biggest health-focused partner is UNC Health, and all of the various departments and organizations that kind of branch out or are affiliated in some way with our in-house kind of hospital and healthcare system. So that would be a pretty big difference between an institution like Elon and UNC. Examples otherwise might be SHAC. We have a clinic that is close to campus that is completely student run and relies on a lot of volunteers, sometimes in more administrative roles and sometimes in more direct service roles, sometimes in interpreting and language service roles. And another thing that I hear a lot about from students is in sort of public health research sort of partnerships. And there's a lot of public health research that happens in the Triangle and in connection to UNC in partnership with different community organizations. So that might be a fair amount of what's represented here as well. I'm also happy to follow up with you more, Mary. Thanks for the question. What type of work are students doing? Fortunately, nearly all of our respondents said they had worked with UNC students in the past 3 years. So that's good. Some said they didn't. They weren't sure why they got the survey, and they still took the time to fill it out, which was great. And we had a few questions for them as well. And a fair amount of them, over 40% worked with, or about 40% worked with more than 20 UNC students. So this is, they have something to say. They've worked with more than just 1 or 2 students over the years. The most common specific organization named that was partnering UNC side was Apple Service Learning. It's our academic service learning program. And that was the most common recruitment method. But the most common answer to that was other. And we have a huge list now of specific departmental listservs and ways that organizations are reaching out to very specific pockets on campus. And that was actually sort of the biggest way, which is interesting for us to hear that that's how most of these partners are working with students, is through very specific channels that aren't on our drop-down list. Roughly half, a little more have worked with students for pay, have actually paid students. A little bit less than half haven't, but we were surprised that that was a roughly even split. So we have some representation of both perspectives here. Most said that they are making significant contributions, which is good to hear. There were a small number who had some opposite end of the spectrum, disagree kind of responses to these questions about making significant contributions and that they're satisfied with the work. But when we looked a little closer, because those are things that we're most interested in hearing about, actually, we looked a little bit closer. We questioned if it's possible that they filled out the wrong end of the survey or something, because most of the qualitative open response feedback we were getting was pretty positive and wasn't consistent with that. So that means that it's important for us to note that most of the feedback that we're getting and looking at here is from people who have taken the time to do the survey, and largely probably because they are pretty satisfied and are wanting to build on this relationship they have with UNC students.
Ryan?
Mm-hmm.
Ruby from NC Central is asking, were some of your national or international partners part of the survey?
We decided in the beginning to limit this to what appeared to be North Carolina-based organizations, which is an important, we basically, I think the primary focus of our work is on domestic partnerships and relationships. And I think that's largely because in our university, there are other departments that really do focus on the international work and do it really well. But yeah, I think that's a really important kind of thread of inquiry as well. Susan.
All right, so we've got another question for you in the chat, if you will. Write, what about working with students do you think is different from working with non-students?
As you can imagine, this is a question we asked them. We're curious what you think your partners would say as well. The timing of the semester and when they're available to volunteer. Very different weekly and season schedules and expectations of project timelines, making educational connections, particularly to their major or even their organization involvement. Logistics, schedules, students with classes availability, transportation, commitment, and consistency. Sounds to me like you know your partners well, if what our partner said is any indication. So thanks for responding, continue to respond. Here's a quick snapshot of some of what we heard. This is just a direct question with an open response box. And here's a quick visual word cloud of our answers. You can see the words that pop are related to experience, energy, or other words related to energy, enthusiasm, eagerness, schedule, flexibility, commitment, and then there's a lot in there about learn and learning. Naturally, these are just words that were used, so there's a fair amount of positive and negative on some of these words. Some partners were interested in saying that they had really flexible schedules and that was a good thing, and others were saying that their schedules were really challenging because they had these courses that were at odd times in the day. To give you a taste of what some of these responses are, we're going to share a few quotes.
Okay, one person said, college students bring a great deal of energy and optimism to our organization, both volunteers and paid staff.
They know more about technology and bring great enthusiasm and new ideas to our work.
Students are very smart, fast learners, and effective workers. They tend to be very eager to learn and help because this is an entryway into their future careers in med school and optometry school, etc.
I have to think about their schedules, whether or not they will return, come up with tasks that fit their time with the organization.
Students fulfilling class requirements do the bare minimum to get credit for their time.
super obvious when they are just trying to get a resume builder. If your heart isn't in it, it shows.
Their maturity level can be lower.
Students can have unrealistic expectations for what employment looks like. We have faced challenges of frustration that they cannot work off-site, punctuality, calling in sick, and generally not reading and referencing our employee policies and protocols. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a taste, other than just the most consistent words used, of the themes that kind of came out.
All right, we've got another question for you. In the chat, write what you think partners would say in response to the following question. What would improve your experience with our students? So think about what you imagine they might have said.
Do you want to alternate reading some of these back, Susan, or can you see the chat?
Let's see.
Nobody's responded yet to this one.
Okay, we'll find out then.
Better preparation for community engagement. Mary Morrison seems to be the first to answer every question.
Mary is quick. And Monique Broadhurst said, realistically prepare students for what to expect at the organization.
Expectations made more clear ahead of time.
More preparation and orientation.
Great. Let's get a few more responses in there.
Expectations about timeline, realistic response times by partners, etc.
Expectations, communication, orientation. Once again, this is kind of validating to me that you all are in pretty good communication with your partners, if what we hear through this project is any indication. So you see the words that pop are probably the same ones that would, if we looked more closely at your responses here: communication, expectation, support, experience, organization, time, commitment, and we'll give you a little bit more concrete of a look at what some of those responses look like.
So the first one is transportation support, a budget provided to organizations to help fund their activities with the organization. Mental health resources for stressed students.
If the students were prepped to act in the most professional manner possible, i.e. notify if you're late or not coming, understand the client before you arrive, appropriate clothing, frequently an issue, one that I don't think about much personally. Yeah.
Oh, I've thought about that one. This one is, we try to be transparent about the time commitment for our agency so that students know what they are volunteering for. Our biggest disappointment is when a student commits to coach a team for a season and then backs away.
If they were less busy and didn't feel the need to be constantly productive and constantly measuring their worth based on what they produced. Many of my students are too overextended so that they are not able to integrate their learning and focus on the things most important to them. That's close to number.
Applicant base, though I know that is somewhat outside the control of UNC.
Need more of them.
Continue providing funding support for our programs. We offer paid internships and provide scholarships for students, but as a nonprofit organization, we depend on grants, donations, and in-kind support to make it happen.
Thank you. We also asked that question in a slightly different way, which was basically, how could we do more to support, to improve your experiences with students? And the top 3 responses here in this order were encouraging student reflection on volunteer experience, which was a little bit of a surprise to us. We often think of reflection as part of the education process of the learning piece of service, but we were hearing that our partners were asking for more of that, and that would improve their work with the students. Offering training, the type of training they suggested was specified, and so we have a list of those, but it was very widely varied, all over the place. And then providing more administrative support, which is something we want to understand a little bit more, look more closely at what that could mean. And when we ask them what makes the strongest positive impact on their experiences, we also gave them the opportunity to say they had negative impact, but for the most part, there was positive impact. And they said that having a connection with a UNC program is what makes the strongest of the list that we provided. This strongest connection, positive impact was connection to a UNC program, a specific program and structure, and then academic credit, and then being paid, and then receiving training, which surprised us a little bit in that sometimes we associate payment as kind of a payment and academic credit as some of the highest forms of accountability for students, but they're saying that the programs are pretty significant. We have a question come in.
Yes, Ryan, you talked about that folks did give you some suggestions for training ideas. Would it be possible that perhaps someone could reach out to you and get the list of what folks suggested? Because Mary is asking.
For sure. And I think Mary has my email, but we also will share our emails on the last slide if you want to stick around for that.
Great, thanks.
And we did look a little bit more closely at training and preparation because that's something that's of interest to us too. It's a big part of what we do. A majority, 60-ish%, said that that the students are prepared or exceptionally prepared, with only a small percentage saying that they're not prepared at all. And we were interested to find that over half of our partners are providing formal training in some way for volunteers. In the focus group, we talked about this a bit more, and a fair amount of them are offering on-site kind of as things come up ad hoc training. So they might have also be included in offering training, but not a formal way. 31% sometimes do. And they really cover a wide variety of topics when we ask them about what trainings they are offering, but most commonly they're connected to specific volunteer activities at that organization in that field, rather than the topics that came up as issues around professionalism and communication, time, project management. In the focus groups, we asked a little bit more about their interest in being involved with campus trainings, and partners were generally saying that they were not interested in us offering trainings specifically for their, but they were interested in us offering trainings in general to students and seeing that as an issue, but not necessarily that we had much that we could specifically offer to their organizations. Additional themes from the focus groups were distance and transportation were big issues. Several of the focus group participants were in rural areas, and we talked a fair amount about the barrier that creates and the drive time and the cost associated with that. Also, just not enough communication from faculty and staff. Some of them said that they'd never heard from faculty and staff and that their relationships were exclusively through students. Sometimes that can be a good thing, but they were asking, the people in the focus group were asking for a little bit more of that. There was a big theme about background check delays, and that apparently is a pretty significant issue with several of the organizations represented, and that if students aren't doing what they're asked to do quickly, it can be a several-week lag and halfway through the semester before they can even get started. Also, connections between student reflection and program evaluation they were seeing, that's part of how they can get more insight on their work, and is through learning about what the students understand. And then we did have some reflection on COVID changes and how it changes everything really that they're doing right now and that we're doing. And it's really questionable whether that's a temporary change or parts of those changes will be long lasting. So we're going to open this up for some conversation here in a minute, but as we look at some of the more significant insights and implications, the ones that we're focusing on most, it seems that the partners do value the connections to UNC programs, like we mentioned before, even more than academic connections or students working for pay. Maybe that means we need to be investing more in programs, and that those structures that exist, or looking more carefully at what parts of the programs are most significant. Also the training piece, that we can recognize that the students are receiving a lot of training through their partners, and there might be ways that we can learn more about those trainings and validate them, create opportunities for those to be recognized within programs on campus a little bit more than they might already be. Also, it's pretty significant that there are so many other UNC connections other than just these relationships and work with students. So potentially there are ways that we can leverage those better than we currently are, and connect those faculty that are working with the partners with the students that are, and build a more complex, more than just two-way relationship there to increase accountability and depth. There's a whole lot more to consider, but we do want to give some time for conversation with all of you. Some of the specific ways that we're using the data, not just sort of for our own understanding and building, is that there were specific questions raised about policies and how things work that we have followed up with. Some partners saw this as an opportunity to ask us questions, and that has been an important part of clarifying transportation policies, how the course request system works if you want to work with course volunteers. We're also hoping to use quotes like we shared with you today in trainings. It's really important for students to hear these voices before they've made the mistakes. And we have used from previous surveys some quotes in these ways, guiding the types of trainings we're offering, not organizational specific or field specific, but more about just professionalism. It sounds like it's a fair amount of what's being asked for here, and communication, project planning. Also, we want to do more at this point now that we've sort of gathered all the data and analyzed it a little bit. We're wanting to share something back with all respondents, and also some of the specific other departments that were mentioned within the survey as programs that were valuable to be working with. Emphasizing student reflection. This can guide what we should be reflecting on with students. And as we have time, we want to be really digging more deeply into the qualitative data, because there's really just so much there that could be helpful to us and more deeply understanding these relationships.
Ryan, can we pause for a second? You talked about one of the findings is this enjoyment of connections, or they value connections with programs. So Patty's asking, what do you mean by that? Is that as distinct from classes and paid work?
I would probably have to look more closely, but my understanding is that I'm thinking of things like the Bonner Leaders Program. That came up as a theme that partners really appreciated their Bonners, and they didn't just talk about UNC students, they talked about Bonners. Sometimes they talked about general UNC students and Bonners, or Apple students and general UNC volunteers. Apples is a little bit complicated because a big part of Apples is academic service learning courses, but we also have some other programs, and sometimes partners didn't always know that came up as well and wasn't part of our presentation, but sometimes partners didn't always know who they're working with. But it seemed like for the partners that did understand a specific programmatic connection, like Bonner, like the Buckley Public Service Scholars Program is mentioned, Apples, that they emphasized that they thought that was particularly valuable. Does that answer your question, Patty? Hard for you to respond, but.
She said, yes, thank you.
Great.
All right, should we move on to this last question here?
It's not the last question, I don't think, but yes.
Should we move on to this second to last question? All right, so in the chat, will you all respond to one or both of the following questions? There you go. The first one is, what surprises you about what we've shared? Were there any surprises in this for you?
And Ryan, while people are typing, we did have an earlier question from Heather. And you had talked about how many of the organizations mentioned many points of connection with UNC. And she's wondering if folks have expressed outreach fatigue, feeling overwhelmed by multiple requests for partnership and contact. And if so, how do you navigate that?
I don't remember that specifically coming up in the survey. We did ask that in the focus group in a forum about when things become a burden and at what point do you feel burdened by these relationships generally. It was a pretty small sample, but I was kind of surprised to hear. I think about that. It sounds like I think about that more than they do, the few people we had in the focus group. Susan's nodding her head, and I think that was in your focus group that we talked. Did you want to say more?
Surprised by that too, that I thought people might think exactly what you were saying, that they're sometimes overwhelmed with too much coming from UNC, but it was just the opposite. People seem to really welcome UNC students as a resource.
And it's being said that the people who are feeling most fatigued by outreach probably are not going to click on a survey and give us additional time and input. And
yeah, that's a good point.
Patty is surprised that we were surprised, you did hear us correctly or me correctly, that community members suggest more student reflection. What do you think your surprise suggests? I think my surprise, I'll speak for myself, suggests that I do think, or I have had thought that our partners were more interested in the service piece than the learning piece, and that they were primarily interested in the work and the people showing up and offering something than they were about the student learning and development. And it links with Heather's question, I think, because I often understand the learning and the reflection piece is kind of additional work that some partners would rather leave to the people whose job, at least explicitly, more in the educational space. But that's obviously an overly simplistic look at it. Susan, what do you think?
I would agree. I mean, as a partner agency, I was surprised by that. I think because I imagine that most people who are using UNC student volunteers are looking for practical help. You come in and do a particular volunteer job and not to really spend much time thinking about the whole learning and reflection piece. So it was a surprise, and a really pleasant surprise.
Yeah, it's not part of most organizations' mission to be interested in college student volunteer or intern development. It may be implicitly, but it's not what they're there for. But it seems like it is a valuable part of what they do. Ruby is not really surprised by what Ruby heard in the survey. Question is, how do we move forward in addressing the needs of the partners, students, and institutions? Well, some of what we're trying to do to move forward is to let this input directly affect how we are preparing students to be better in the field through the direct voices of the community partners, which are more valuable than us just saying what community partners say, and also allowing us to choose the focus areas of our trainings and our orientations to students based on data of what partners have said they're interested in, which is not getting into the technical aspects of the work that they're doing. And it's more about this, sounds like the professionalism, the project management, time management, commitment, communication world. You know. Katie said, my surprise was, I'm happy to see your predictions of community partner responses align with the responses community partner had. That's great to see our understanding of what they experience is accurate, although we should continue conversations and surveying community partners to continue to grow mutual benefiting relationships and student experiences. Yeah, this is definitely not a one-time thing. And we do, and probably a lot of us have individual programmatic evaluation and feedback opportunities, particularly in the more intensive partnerships. And this was intended to be kind of a broad look at a lot of the different connections that was less program specific, but which is something we don't do on a regular basis.
Another question for you. What questions do you have that we might be able to answer or that we should pursue further?
People have kind of jumped to that some already. I work mostly with the programs mentioned. I think we also see partners making distinctions between those students who are part of the program and those who are not, but we certainly still hear that same concerns about general trainings, about things we thought we didn't need to say. Yeah. The things we didn't think we needed to say, I guess, like how to dress. Oh, that's actually exactly what was added there. Are there ways we can better acknowledge community partners as co-educators, especially when students receive academic credit? Yeah, that's another good assumption check for me, at least. I tend to think that that is could be a burden to try to involve partners in syllabus review and in classroom experiences. And I've heard that from some partners that don't want to do a class visit, that they'd rather send a student volunteer actually to share from the organizational perspective about working in it, because they get so many classroom requests. But I think it's good to not assume that. I think I probably over-assumed that. Susan, do you have reflections on that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to depend on the individual partner agencies. I would welcome it. I'd love to go talk to the classroom and do that kind of thing. But we're a small organization, and so we're not overwhelmed by requests. So I think it would just depend on what the agency is.
Mm-hmm. Mary Beth Faust said, call when you won't be there. Yeah, it seems like a thing that a lot of us probably as professionals take for granted that students might not, or that calling makes, calling also can make some younger generations uncomfortable, the actual phone call piece rather than text. So that might need to be increasingly a explicit conversation. Well, I think we've allowed some time for those questions. We have a few more minutes. We'll leave this up here for folks who might want to reach out to me or Susan or both of us. Susan, as I'm looking at these pictures, I'm thinking about my lack of a quarantine haircut rather than the aging piece. but
you are not the only one.
thank you all for joining us today, though. And Patty's adding a little bit here, but I think it's just to us. So I will look at that and respond to Patty.
Well, if there are any final questions coming in, I'll take a minute and I will say thank you to Ryan and Susan. I want to thank everybody for attending. It does look like Patty's question is for everyone, so we'll get to that in a second. But I do want to remind you that our next session will start at 1, and it's a working lunch, so feel free to eat. Irving's going to talk for about 30 minutes about tips and strategies for social media communication in terms of service learning and community engagement in higher education. Also, if you have any questions or concerns about any of the afternoon sessions, maybe you can't find your link or the email, please send me an email and let me know. And also just want to remind you that we are going to have a closing session today. It'll only be about 30 minutes. We're going to give some highlights around what has been discussed throughout the day. And then I'm also going to spend a little time centering our work in the times that we're in. I don't want people to think that we are not discussing Black Lives Matter and COVID-19. We're going to spend some time around that in the closing session. So I, again, want to thank Ryan and Susan for this work that they're doing and this model for how to assess partners, and I'll let you all handle that final question.
Great. We got an additional one too. So Patty says, I also think it depends on how the relationship begins and the ways in which it does and does not nurture everyone as coeducators. Is this a starting point that, is it the starting point that defines the partnership, or is it a later add-on? Probably makes a big difference. I'm particularly interested in how we start off this way. Yeah, so I guess that's a little bit more of a comment, but yeah, it does seem, I mean, and we're really looking at a wide variety of partners. That's was a big topic of conversation we didn't get into, of what do we even mean by partners that we're trying to sort out at the Center for Public Services. Should we have a clear definition of what we mean when we say community partner? Because some of these are just students worked with this organization and tell us about it, and some of them are much more active relationships, like with the SMART program that Susan and Volunteers for Youth work intensively with. Would you be willing to share your survey instrument? I think so. Reach out, please, Alessandra. And I think our time is up.
Thank you, everyone. We'll see you soon.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Thank you.